Hi, everybody. It's Danielle again with another new episode of Made Possible by Pop Culture, the podcast. This is the show where we deep dive into pop culture's past and present with a new guest each episode. Today, we're going deep into the world of filmmaking, primarily documentary filmmaking, with my guest, Clair Titley, a producer and director known for One Born Every Minute, The British Woman on Death Row, and The Contestant. Claire's latest project, though, is a three-part docuseries called Friends Like These, The Murder of Skylar Neese, which premieres on Hulu and Disney Plus in just a few days, March 6th. So, Claire, of course, I have to say welcome to Made Possible by Pop Culture. I have so many questions. Just going to
Thank you.
say
Thank
that up
you for
front.
having me on.
I'm going to say that up front. Documentary filmmaking is something that I really love, and I always have like the same dumb questions about, which I'm probably not going to ask you about because usually they start with like, how do you know when it's over? Because you could keep going forever with certain
But
subjects.
that's the hardest question. It's kind of like how to know when to stop, isn't it? Like Chanel used to say about fashion, like kind of take something off, And I think Matisse used to say something like, what's the something similar, like, when you can, when you're done,
Mm.
when you can't take anything else off the painting or something along those kind of lines. So that is the hardest question. That's not a dumb question.
I mean, it just feels like, when you're inside the project, you have a better insight. You know the story you want to tell, even if it maybe changes as you go. So sometimes when I'm watching it, because I don't have that insight, like that's where my mind goes is like, well, there's so much, maybe not we'll get to Friends Like These in a few minutes, maybe not in one like that, only because this is a story about a murder. And so, there's only so much you can do once the person has been murdered and they found the culprit and they've sentenced them. So maybe that there's a different entry point there. We will get there. For everybody listening, I like to start in the past. So I do want to start a little bit generally in the sense of like, documentary filmmaking is so specific. I'm curious if there is something from your youth, from your childhood that inspired you to get into this world, or like kind of where it all started in terms of, did you want to be a filmmaker first and then you found documentary, or what was that kind of?
It was definitely that way round that I kind of fell into documentary almost kind of by accident. And when I had fallen into documentary, I kind of went, oh my, this is like suddenly I was like, hang on, the truth is much more interesting than the fiction, and that so it was a kind of an accident and quite late, to be honest. Um, but I think so I didn't really grow up going to cinema very often as
Okay.
a child. I grew up a lot abroad
Hmm.
in sort of Asia and Southeast Asia, and we didn't have so I didn't really go to the cinema a great deal, and we didn't have sort of regular TV that you get in the UK. I was kind of watching this thing called Star Plus, which was like this sort of satellite TV network. And it's funny, it's an interesting thing. There's certain kind of like gaps in my like cultural knowledge
Mm.
from like when you grow up and people refer to things and you're like, what? And I realize people the same age as me, and I've just like missed entire chunks of like cultural reference points because I just wasn't there. Although actually some of them are kind of quite American because on Star Plus, we used to watch Santa Barbara, The Bold and the Beautiful, and old episodes of MASH, and then it would get pretty boring quite quickly. So for a kid, for a teenager, I'd sort of look elsewhere, and they had a channel called Channel V,
Mm.
and this was like Asia's knockoff MTV. They even had like a V in like square brackets so that if you kind of squinted your eyes, it looked like MTV, like you do, proper kind of
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
you're like the kind of like knockoff jeans, you got the knockoff
Right.
MTV.
But that's what I find
I
interesting. Like
shouldn't say
when,
that because actually I was going to say it was a really good channel. It was a really good
well,
channel.
I mean, I do think that it's relative, right? Like it was a really good channel because it's what you had. You didn't know what you were missing. And maybe you weren't missing anything. Maybe it was showing you like all the same music videos we had here in America. I don't know that. I don't know if we know that because you weren't here and I wasn't there. So it's hard to know,
Yeah.
like, were you getting the exact same things at the exact same time? I always remember, I mean, you brought up soap operas a second ago, and like that's a great entry point for me because I was a huge soap opera fan in my teenage years. And I always knew like if you talk to people in Australia, which I was doing on the internet, they were getting things like episodes behind us. Like they weren't on the same timeline. And so I wonder about that. Like the things that you're watching in those formative years, you may not realize are a little bit behind maybe when they first came out
Totally.
here. How did that, I mean, you're talking about this channel V for music videos and music in general. How did that influence like what you were gravitating towards, like the kinds of things you were interested in those years?
Mm. Well, I mean, I'd say like first on the point of like getting things kind of like late, that
Mm.
was definitely a huge thing. Like in the UK, we used to get everything behind America. It's why it was so exciting to go on a flight because you get to see stuff that wasn't even in the cinema in the UK or Asia, but it
Oh,
was,
wow.
it was on a plane. It was mad. I mean, now it's like
Oh,
whatever. You can see this stuff. It's not a big deal. But back then it was just that was the best thing about flying was the fact that you kind of like there was a chance you get to see these movies. But so everything was kind of really behind. So there was definitely that regard. And actually, you know what, I'll explain kind of, yeah, my obsession with kind of teen movies, I suppose, kind of
mm.
relation to this new project as well later on that kind of came from there. But also VTV with these music videos they would have not just the music videos, and I don't know if they did this on MTV, but they would list the directors as well.
Oh,
So you would
yeah.
get to see who the director of all the music videos were. And they were like little movies. And I've got to admit, I don't watch a lot of music videos now, but they just felt like they were just so creative and they were like little miniature stories. And I was already really obsessed with music. I was a kind of indie kid who would record mixtapes by like having two cassette recorders like next to each other and then I press record and play at the
Hmm.
same time, like really clunky, bad quality. So then what I used to do was I used to do like mix VHS tapes. So I would
Oh, that's fancy.
like wait, I
I
don't
didn't
know.
have two VCRs.
No, but it wasn't two VCRs. It was like recording directly from the TV. I would kind of wait until there was a music video that I liked. So I'd have to sit like
Okay.
wait all day. I think this is kind of like the joy of boredom, When you have very little kind of, there's no social media, there's like barely any TV,
Mm.
this is kind of like boredom breeds creativity, doesn't
No,
it?
I think that's
I think.
true. Yeah. And I think
Um,
also like you being inspired by what you were seeing and wanting to save it in a world where that wasn't really an option. You couldn't go and replay this music video whenever you wanted, like there was no YouTube or, there
no,
wasn't even, there was a time maybe late 90s where they started selling them on like VHS and DVD. And I mean, that was specific ones. It wasn't everything you
yeah,
might have wanted. And you'd still have to put them together in that mixtape
yeah,
style, because it would be like this
yeah.
just on this disc, this one on this disc.
Yeah, they would be in different directors. So I was kind of like it was the like Michel Gondry was kind of like my absolute hero. And then there was Mike Mills and
Hmm.
Spike Jones and Chris Cunningham and Jonathan Glazer. I mean they were kind of like, and of course they most of them like went on to do kind of like amazing things afterwards as well, but it was this kind of experimental form that just felt so kind of exciting. And I mean, I'm sure there were, but I wasn't aware of any. It's like I was thinking back now, I don't remember any female music video directors. I'm sure that there must have been at the
I
time, but it
mean,
was
there
kind
were
of,
few. That's the thing is like
yeah,
there are more now, but I mean
yeah,
it's always been a deficit. So
yeah.
I'm not surprised to hear you say like they're artists no matter what, but I'm not surprised to hear you say that these artists were all male for that time period.
Yeah, and but they did feel kind of very experimental. And you asked about documentary. Actually, I was remembering the other day that it was actually I think it was a Mike Mills music video for Air, and he did
Hmm.
a film for the song All I Need, and he made a little documentary. I think that was maybe the first kind of like not my first time exposed to documentary, that's not true, but maybe the first time I was exposed to documentary in a kind of a more interesting way than kind of like the standards of things. So he
Right.
he made this film about a couple that were in love, and it's very sweet, sort of observational kind of film, but it was really beautiful. That was a sort of a documentary style. But Michel Gondry was kind of like I was kind of quite obsessed with those kind of like slightly surreal and quite theatrical kind of sets. Everything was kind of a
Mhm.
bit in camera and really and I kind of got like the Cibo Matto video for oh, is it Sugar Water? That I, that one, which again is like a kind of an apartment building,
Hmm.
that he kind of like and a split screen and stuff. It was just kind of like for me was I was just like, this is insanely amazing. And so I think maybe because it's all in camera,
Hmm.
um, you can kind of see how it's done a little bit, and it's kind of like playing on the cleverness of it
Right.
all. So that was just I just yeah, and so many kind of Bjork videos. So they really inspired me and kind of made me feel like, well, maybe this is a direction that I kind of want to go in.
Hmm.
Um, and I think to start with, I felt like maybe either music videos or drama or some along those kind of lines,
Right.
because that's much more glamorous, isn't it, than documentary? It's not
Well, I don't know
documentary's not
about
glamorous.
that. That's a whole other debate, I think, because I think you control more as the director of a documentary than you really do of a narrative scripted anything. Because unless you also wrote it, and depending on who your actors are, like there are certain things, just horror stories that I have heard being in this business about, everyone thinks of the director as the leader on set, and that is supposed to be true, especially like tonally, but with the final cut, if you have a lot of big egos coming in, I think it might
Mm.
be harder sometimes to get your vision across as a director of a scripted project than a
I think
documentary.
that's in a way maybe back then as well why being a music video director, I get the impression that they had a lot of freedom and a lot of
Mm,
creativity because it was still a relatively, I mean, it's not, in the 90s, I'm sort of talking
yeah,
about early 90s, but like it was still a relatively kind of new medium in that kind of regard. And, and music video directors were kind of gods in that way, they were kind of like revered. So it felt like as if, they had and from what I've kind of read since, it felt like they had a lot of kind of creative control over things.
yeah. Now you
Mm.
mentioned these mixed videos that you're making. Do
Oh
you
yeah.
remember what you were putting together? Do you remember any of the specific music videos that you would sit by the TV and wait for?
I remember Daft Punk Around the World. Do you remember that was kind of like where they go up and down the steps? That was
Yeah.
definitely one. And there's the Massive Attack one, which is again is another one of those like mad apartment buildings, with Tracy Thorn. I'm trying to remember the name of that song. Um, Oh, but anything that Bjork did was always kind of like totally out there.
And when you're talking
Foo
about these,
Fighters stuff, yeah.
are you are
Mm.
you mostly saving them and waiting for them because of the visuals and the direction, or how much was it like
It's a bit of,
music and visuals?
I think it's a bit of both. I don't think I'd have gotten into Bjork if I wasn't into the visuals. Do you know what I mean?
Okay,
I think
yeah.
just by itself. So it kind of and the really sad thing is I don't think anybody else watched these tapes other than me.
Well,
I
why?
think
I
it
mean,
was just
but
they were
also,
just for me,
yeah, I was gonna say, why would
and that
they?
was it.
Sometimes it's like your diary. It's like I'm putting together all of these, or like diary might be a little bit old-fashioned now, but like when Pinterest would have all those mood boards, or
Yeah.
like, or vision, or whatever word we want to use, just like this is something that I need to look at a lot to feel a certain way, creative,
Yeah.
inspired, whatever it might be. And especially with music, there's always that extra layer of like using it to get through an emotion in your life, which maybe the songs do differently than watching the videos, but at the same time, like, well, then you have this tape you've created for yourself for multiple reasons.
Yeah. No, exactly, exactly. I wonder where they are now, actually. I wonder where any of those like VHS tapes are. They're
I know,
probably
I was
worth a
gonna say you
fortune
can't,
somewhere, aren't they?
you probably can't still play them. Do you still have a VCR? I don't still have a VCR.
No, but I do think I could every now and again I'm like I should have hung on to that because that would kind of probably be worth like a small fortune somewhere, like blank cassettes are now in that whole my daughter, she like came to her friend had made her an actual mixtape with a cassette, and she came to me and my husband the other day and she goes, I've got, and she's actually got like a CD player and
Hmm.
radio and stuff in her room that she plays all our old CDs and collects them in like thrift stores and charity shops and things. And it's got a tape cassette player in it. And she came to us and she goes, I've got this thing, but could you come and help me? She goes, I'm really
Oh
worried
no.
about damaging it. How do I play it? And we were just laughing because like cassettes were like the most robust things, weren't they? You could throw them across a room and they would be, I mean, compared to a CD or a record or
Yes.
whatever,
Yes.
Cassettes were like the kind of the, they were fine,
I
the
just
idea of,
remember, I don't know if this happened to you, but I remembered having to take the pencil and wind the tape back in. And sometimes wasn't paying attention and it would wind with like a crooked and then like that would destroy the sound. So
but
I
then
do
you
know
can
where she's
splice
coming
it.
from. Like
Did you
that's
ever try splicing though?
no,
That
I
was
wasn't
kind of
that
like, then I
technical.
get into the whole thing of splicing them together and kind of like, with the thinnest piece of tape to see if you could get it. And then kind of like, I mean, that was like, I think I had far too much time on my hands at
Well,
the
no,
time.
I mean, you cared. I would just, if it broke to that level, I would just either try to get my parents to buy me another one or like go back to the old way of what you were saying, tape it off of something, like wait for it to come to
Yeah.
the radio. Because I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. If I've broken it to this point, I'm only going to make it worse. I will say the one thing I did learn to splice was I took a film class in high school and they taught us how to splice film. And this was like,
Wow.
we were in the days of digital, but they were like, we want you to learn what it was like before this so that you understand how
That's
good you
cool.
have it. And I was like, that's great. And like, that's what made me then want to go on to film. Well, I wanted to go on to film school for other reasons, but when I then got to film school and realized like, oh, we're never going to touch that again. I was like, oh,
Mm.
I'm glad I had that lesson, but I'm also really glad I never have to touch it again because it was so daunting of just the like, how much you really have to plan. And if you go back because you've made a mistake or you want to change something, how easy it is to mess it up.
Yeah.
Not for
Yeah.
me. I
Got
will
you.
say that. I
No.
do greatly love an erase or a control Z or whatever, you know?
Yeah, no, 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 absolutely, absolutely. There's something about that as well, though, back in then as well, was the fact that you would have things and you would listen to things from start to finish. Do you know what I mean? There was
Yeah.
no kind of like skipping. There was no like, certainly like no watching anything on double speed. It was kind of like, there all of that. And if somebody kind of like needed to go into everybody paused it, you ran to the VCR to pause something, because all of that, because it was just so hard to kind of like then rewind it, it was just a right pain, and then you'd over rewind and everybody had to watch another 20 minutes or whatever. So it was a real kind of like, there's something quite mindful maybe about kind
Mm,
of like having that forced kind of like being forced to sit down and watch something in that kind of way, or listen to an album or whatever it was. I
that's
don't know, in
true.
that way.
So you
Anyway,
mentioned Michel Gondry. I want to take you back. Do you remember the first music video that you really, not the first one you ever saw of his, but the first one you
yeah.
ever really noticed was like, oh, that's Michel. I now recognize his style. I now recognize like what it is I love about him. Do you remember what that was?
Yeah, it was definitely that, like it was Cibo Matto, it was Sugar Water, it was the kind of the where oh, I don't know, like Miho and I've forgotten the other woman's name for a moment, and they're basically they're playing out the video, they're playing out the song, one in reverse and the other one kind of forwards and backwards, and then it's split screen and they're going up and down. And he built an entire set to do this, whereas now I'm sure it would all be kind of, whatever on a soundstage or whatever. But it built this entire set to kind of do this. And I think it's all one take. I think he did a lot of things that were all like, I might be wrong, but I'm pretty certain it was all one take, and a lot of what he did was all one take, and just incredibly well. I mean, it is theatre, really. A lot of what he did is kind of theatre in that
Hmm.
way. And I remember being really inspired by that, and that kind of, in a way, got me into Cibo Matto, which kind of
Hmm.
who I'd not really come across before, and that inspired that kind of love affair with sort of like J-pop and things, and
Okay.
then like. So my best friend and I would kind of like share mixed CDs of like J-pop, tracks with a lot of Cibo Matto in there and Shonen Knife and all these kind of. So that kind of got me into a whole genre of music, and kind of took me off on this tangent. But there's definitely something, and I've always been very into theatre as well, and I still go to theatre a lot. I think there's something about um the limitations that theatre gives you that like forces people to be incredibly creative,
Right.
and today as well, it's almost kind of like um knowing that you have all this access, and you could pretty much do whatever you want on film, on screen. But in theatre, you have to keep everybody's attention to that kind of like level, but with such limited
Hmm.
means. So I always find that sometimes some of the most creative work I see is kind of is still in theatre. So I think I've always been drawn to that. There's definitely every now and again, if I'm a bit stuck for ideas or like, oh, how can we show this or how can we do that? I kind of think, oh, how can I make it a bit more Gondry-esque? How can
Hmm.
I kind of throw, I'm not suggesting that my work is Gondry-esque, but
Well,
you
but you,
feel like
no,
mm.
no, finish your thought, and then I will ask this.
Well, I was going to say I kind of like I try and move in that direction and not be afraid of being creative in that way, and trying to push it if you possibly can. It never got, I think it's just a good way to kind of to be and to think. And sometimes actually doing things in camera is kind of ends up being as creative as doing things with digital
Yeah.
effects or VFX or whatever it happens to be, in that way.
Yeah, I will say I think it's more, I usually find it more impressive when I find out that something is done practically because it
Mm.
takes a lot of hands-on artisans and like there's artisans certainly in the post world and in the digital effects world, but to me, it feels more like a team coming together to do something on set rather than like maybe one or two people sitting behind a computer manipulating something. And so that's something
Yeah.
that's one of the things I was obviously struck by when you're picking out the names of the music videos you're describing is that like, yeah, there are so many things that they're doing practically that today they would just do with VFX, like the either,
And you could just do in your bedroom at home. That's what's amazing
well,
about it as well.
now,
I
yeah,
mean, you
that's the
think
other
like
thing. Is like, yeah,
that's what's
now
so
with green
crazy.
screen and with all the AI technology, like it's becoming so much easier to do a lot of things that I'm not impressed by them anymore. Because I'm just like, oh, at like this, little kids that are growing up with this technology from age 5 are better at it because it's
Yeah.
innate to them. But I did want to go back
But
because you were talking
mm.
about, thinking like kind of what would Michel Gondry do in a sense. And you said that there's kind of a link to the sugar water video to the contestant, and I was hoping you could kind of talk a little bit
Oh,
about what you meant by the when you use the word link in the sense of was that the inspiration and the way of thinking, or did you go a little further?
well, weird. I mean, there was actually there were scenes that I actually shot for the contestant with Nasabi that we kind of did in Tokyo that were quite Gondry-esque, but didn't make the final cut to the film actually.
Okay.
However, that's not actually what I was referring to. What it was more was with that was it was more about Cibo Matto and I said my best friend and I would like share these like J-pop mixtapes, mixed CDs all the time. And when we came to do the contestant, it was obviously set in the 90s,
Hmm.
when I'd been a teenager in Japan, and it was that kind of era. So I remember messaging my best mate going, quick, go into the loft, like kind of dig out all those mixtapes, those mixed CDs, because I need a soundtrack for this movie.
Mm-hmm.
And the exec Amit Day, he was really supportive of that as well. He's like, yeah, we've definitely got to try and bring some of that era into the film. And it turns out it's incredibly hard to license music from the 90s because they just used to like basically just steal so many samples for things that, like nowadays it's kind of quite
Oh,
hard to
yeah, that's
reproduce that
true.
music. So I was kind of like, you fall in love with all these tracks and they go, oh, we get so far down and couldn't clear them. And, there is a few in there, but there was one track in particular by Cibo Matto. It wasn't Sugarwood, it was a different track. And that I really wanted for the front of the film.
Hmm.
And um, we just couldn't clear it. It was just getting really difficult. And so I kind of did that thing that you kind of that attitude that you have is basically when you've made low budget documentaries, which is kind of like, I'll just call them myself. So I just sort of like, I'll just write to Miha Hattori and just say, really love your music. I'm a massive fan and I'm making this film and I really want it at the beginning. And I just think it would just something about her and Cibo Matto, the fact that they were like a Japanese band that lived in New York and I was making this film that was kind of like straddling these two cultures. And I was like, it just felt perfect. And she messaged me back, which I was like, kind of, my teenage self was like, oh my God. And she messaged me back and said, like, yeah, sorry, I think it's going to not be possible because of X, Y, and Z. She said, but don't worry, we could write a track together for the start of the film. And I was like, what? I remember like, yeah, showing my other half going, have you seen this? Does she know? It was mad. So we ended up Miho mostly wrote this
Well,
track, but
that's why I was laughing because the way that that sounds like it's the easiest thing in the world for somebody to write a song. And I'm like, maybe for you, but I don't know.
I know. So bless it, we did go back and forth a bit. I wouldn't say that I kind of wrote it with her, but like she was very respectful of my opinions and everything else, and we did go back and forth. But she watched the film, she wrote the lyrics kind of like based on her feelings towards
Mhm.
Nasby and all this, and so
Yeah.
she wrote this kind of title track for the film. And so for me, it was just so, it was like it kind of went all the way back to those days of like
Yeah.
kind of like watching being in Nepal and watching this kind of like Asian TV networks and music videos and things that so it was just a really important thing for me and kind of made a big deal. So
Yeah.
it was so great. And then she came along to the kind of like we had a screening in New York at Doc NYC and all this stuff, and it was great. And it was just it was all kind of dreams come true for me, basically. It was like total dreams come true.
I love that because I do think that that is just watching that documentary and hearing the song, like I never would have guessed. You know what I mean? I never would have guessed this like personal backstory to it.
Yeah,
I love
yeah,
it.
yeah.
I do want to turn to your newest project. I do want to turn to
Mm,
Friends Like These, because it is, I mean, we were just talking about The Contestant. It's very different. It is a true crime docuseries. So it is not entirely different from other series you've done that have touched the crime world, but it is a series. So I do want to start there with
mm.
when you embark on a project, how do you determine if it's a film or a series?
This particular one was kind of, I think I came on board and they'd already kind of like gone, we believe that this is a three-parter. So it was something that I was working with Dorothy Street Pictures and they'd been developing it to a certain degree and kind of gone around the houses a little bit. And I totally agreed with them. It worked really well as three parts. I mean, those three parts changed like so much
Mm,
in the course of time that we were making the film and then making the series. But it did, it felt like they were just too many twists and turns really
mm,
in order to be able to. I felt like we would lose things, and when you have something that's a three-part or a series, you get this opportunity to really delve into characters, into plot, and um and to be fair, like actually the contestant probably could have got away with something kind of much longer. I'm glad that we did do it as a film,
yeah.
but there were so many
I
plot
was gonna
twists
say
that
I do feel
we
like there you could do a follow-up for sure. Yeah.
well, there were so many plot twists that we had to leave out of there, and
Mm,
actually, and that was, we'd kind of committed to a feature, and I'm glad that we did. However, um, it was really nice in Friends Like These to be able to have that time to kind of explore, and then also with that, the kind of the support that came with it, like the producers that came on board and the story producers and different, more than one editor,
yeah.
kind of working across different, then all those different opinions, which I love. I love kind of like, film is the one of the very few creative teamwork sort of art forms. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Where it's really collaborative in that kind of sense. So with a series, you get that even more so,
Hmm.
and it's wonderful. And it's hard because you have to lose a little bit of control as well, because somebody else is going to know much more
Yeah.
detail than you about something. I can't be on top of everything. But yeah, it just felt natural that it would be three parts.
Okay, so this is normally where I would give a spoiler alert and say a little bit about the project. I'm gonna say I don't think we need the spoiler alert because this is a real case, and so it's easy to just Google before you watch anything, even the trailer, like who this person is and who did it. But I will say, just for people who did not Google or don't want to Google, obviously it's in the title, The Murder of Skylar Neese, a teenage girl who gets murdered in 2012 in the summer. And at first, she's just considered missing. No one knows she's been murdered. And it takes about 6 months, I believe, for one of her friends to effectively confess. And that turns out that two of her friends killed her together, which is why it's called Friends Like These, The Murder of Skylar Neese. So I want to back up with you because a story like this obviously has the interest and the intrigue in the crime itself, even though this is more than 10 years ago. Obviously, crime in general is still very popular, but then it also has this extra layer of like these people who you thought loved her and these people who you thought like had her back did not have her back, and there's like a very twisted human story there. So I'm curious, when you came on, like what was it that made you want to come on board a project like this? What is the story that like what is the piece of the story that was most intriguing to you in the beginning, and if it changed as it went on? Because I will also say, for people who are about to check out the show, I think what is done very interestingly is also the way you pull in the social media aspect, and the way that it's like it's about these kids. It's also about like how they're presenting in different ways, like the mask they wear online or not, the mask they wear in school or not. Like there's extra layers to this story than, had this been a pre-social media murder, which there are also those as well. We're just not telling those stories.
No, absolutely. I think the first thing that, I mean, the first thing that connected with me first of all was like I had a preteen at home, and I just connected with Dave and Mary Neese and the fact that the horror that they'd gone through in losing their daughter. And that was the first thing that I could kind of like, well, can barely imagine how horrific it must have been for them. And then you kind of dig deeper into the story and learn more about Skylar. And then it was definitely my 16-year-old self that kind of
Mm.
started kind of connecting with her. And she'd left this amazing sort of archive really online of like,
Yeah.
that, I mean, tweets and texts and messages, and then the bits of writing as well that her parents were like kind of like trusted us with. And so I think what we really, really wanted to do was try and tell this story from the inside out, to kind of like try and get. I really wanted audiences to kind of get their heads back in what it was like to be 16,
Hmm.
um, and to try and remember what it was like. Because it's such a difficult time, It's like when you're a teenager and um, it's that time when suddenly, I mean, like I'm experiencing now with my own daughter, like, suddenly I'm not the
Right.
most important person anymore. And it's really sad. And like her friends are much more important than me. And what they say matters much more
Mm.
than what I say. But it is that thing I do remember. And, consequences seem much more kind of arbitrary, a bit kind of abstract, and things are just really intense, and it's beyond just a hormonal thing, it's the way that their brains are wired. And so we were really keen to kind of get people back in that world, and that's actually one of the things we did. And you're right about the social media side, but also one of the things that we did was draw a lot of inspiration from teen movies
Okay.
of the time, and kind of like things. So I worked like with the DP and the colorist really early on. I kind of like was talking to the colorist really early on and kind of going, right, let's design a color palette that properly reflects um, teen movies of that era. So I was kind of like looking at films like Eighth Grade, and
Hmm.
and then things from my childhood like Ferris Bueller, and trying to draw out those color palettes. I mean, we looked at Skylar's pictures of her bedroom as well, and draw out those colors.
Right.
And we found this incredible location to do the interviews. I like the DP Kevin Robertson and I. We were literally skipping down the corridors. We saw these high school corridors that were pastel colors, and we were just, I mean, like we were beside ourselves. We were like, this is.
Mm.
So we tried
So
to draw on
that
that,
was
and
not the actual school she went to then. That
that
was
was not
the
the
place
actual.
you found. Okay. Okay.
No, 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 no.
I wasn't sure.
Um, no, no, yeah, it wasn't the actual place. And we had a fantastic composer, Agnieszka Chase, who'd done the music for Heartstopper, and
Oh.
so yeah, so it kind of, and she'd also done some amazing serious documentaries as well. This is kind of like the perfect amalgamation of the two, and she wrote this fantastic score that's kind of just feels like 2012 teen
Hmm.
popness, in that kind of era, but then kind of goes a bit darker as the story
Yeah.
goes on.
And I
But
know that obviously
mm,
Mean Girls was not a 2012 movie, but I felt like bringing in Skylar's Diary, and like it almost felt like a little burn booky to me. I don't know if that was one of your inspirations or
yeah,
not, but I was like, this is, and it was interesting because it was like she was not a Regina George. She was not intending to make it as a burn book. It's just like, these are my emotions. And it just sometimes, especially when then you add, like, as you said, the social media on top of it, it just sometimes got to that level of like, okay,
Yeah.
we're very angry with each other now, and obviously it escalated and turned into something terrible. But I don't know, there were a lot of those references that I kept thinking of, or even Rena Verk, who was killed in the late 90s, that then turned into the limited series Under the Bridge.
Oh
I feel like
yes,
I
yeah.
mean, not that I can draw the direct comparison, but just
No.
like similar themes, similar
And Cruel
reference
Intentions is
points.
one of the ones. It was one of the ones that I kind of went back to and was kind of remember. I remember kind of rewatching that for this as well,
Okay. That
as one
makes
of
a
the as
lot
one
of
of the kind of
sense. Yeah.
and but it's kind of like frightening. That is kind of how it was. A lot of it was kind of playing out, but all of this was in this really, really unique period of time because there's something about 2012 or 2010 to 2014. I don't know what the specific kind of like that era
Yeah.
that you had this generation who were the kind of guinea pigs of social media, really, because before then, there was really no social media. Or if there was, certainly you didn't have smartphones. And then after this period, like with my daughter and with teens now, um, they've grown up with it. We're really
Yeah.
aware of the dangers. As parents, we kind of know what to look at. I mean, I'm not saying we've got it right, but we have a sense of what's going
Right.
on,
Right.
whereas back then they were just sharing everything like it was online diaries. I mean, I
Yeah.
think they said, a lot of her friends have said as much. They're like, and it wasn't just how I'm feeling that day, it was like how I'm feeling this second, what
Yeah.
literally I'm walking up the stairs and absolutely everything because they could, and they felt like they were just telling their friends. They
Hmm.
had no kind of concept, and in a way they kind of were because the adults weren't
Well, I was
looking.
gonna say
It
nobody
was
else is
all,
following them, right? Because like, who are you? And you're not posting anything world-shattering outside of your bubble. So probably it was just their
mm,
friends. But within
yeah.
their friends, it becomes larger. If you're there was one, I mean, we're not going to get into the deep weeds because I do want everybody to watch this and I don't want to spoil certain things the way that you reveal them. But there was
Mm.
this one, it felt like one message from Skylar that really felt like a tipping point to me, where it was like I don't remember the exact wording that she used, but it was a public message and it was basically like the things I could tell and I would tell everybody. And it felt very coded of the relationship between Sheila and Rachel, who ended up murdering her because Rachel was in a very conservative family and they had hooked up and she was afraid of like what would happen if that came out, which maybe, who knows? I'm not in their heads. I don't know if that's true of their motive.
Yeah.
I don't think they've ever said to that
I
extent.
think that's the hardest. Yeah, I think that's the hardest thing about this. I mean, it's also the thing that I love. I mean, I do love projects where there aren't any easy answers
Right.
and that like kind of are a bit unended or not unended, but that make you really think and question things and debate stuff. I mean, I do love that, and I think that's kind of always worthy rather than kind of neatly packaging everything up. And that there aren't really any real answers as to why they did it, which makes it really hard. And all of the different factors in there, that their age, the circumstances, the social media at the time, they all contributed to this,
Yeah.
but by themselves, none of them are one particular reason. And I think actually it was one of the prosecutors who said all it really took was for somebody to say, should we not do this? And it probably wouldn't have
Mm.
happened. It's like that kind of, it's really how it's, yeah, it's, it's very difficult in that circumstance. The only two people who really know the real motives are
Right.
not talking about it.
Now, I'm very thankful that you centered Skylar in this story, and I'm curious if there was, or what the conversation might have been to try to
Mm.
get Sheila and Rachel to talk on the record. If that was considered and said, we don't want to, considered and said, they don't want to, like so much, we talk about this all the time. So much is usually talked about the criminals, not the victims. And obviously, this goes the other way. But I'm just curious how that was decided.
We did reach out to them, and we did reach out to them a few times while making the series, and to their families as well, and we didn't have a response from them. And I think it would have. It's hard to know what level they would have been involved if they were,
Right.
and it's hard to kind of suppose what would have happened. But making this Skylar centric was something that we really wanted to do. And it's kind of really easy to say that, but it's much harder to give somebody agency and voice when they've gone, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And particularly when our story was kind of, finishes, it's like, and we were like, how can we get Skylar back in? How can we kind of like not lose sight of her, not give too much, I don't give too much screen time to the perpetrators, but kind of like, how can we just make sure that everybody remembers that this is about Skylar, and allow her to tell her story in the way, and not just be reduced to a plot point, which is kind of, it's easy to do. So that was, I think maybe the sort of the teen movie sort of style in
Mm.
her narrating it a little bit kind of helped in that way
Yeah.
as well. And we were really fortunate that, her parents, put their trust in us with, the bits of writing and her tweets and text messages,
Yeah.
all these things kind of so that we could really get a sense of who she was. And what I had a lot of admiration for them was that they said from the start, if you're going to do this, don't make her out to be a saint. They were like, she was intelligent, beautiful, the most loyal friend, all these wonderful things, they said, but she was cheeky and she was smoking weed behind our backs, and she would, or
But
she
she was a
would like
teenager.
answer
You know what I
back
mean?
and
Like
all,
none of that was that
and they were like,
bad. I don't think
but they
anyway.
wanted her to be real, and they were really like they held us to account on the opposite of what you'd think. You'd sort of like, oh, can you make her a bit like, no, 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 just make her real, make everybody know who she really, really was. And I have a lot of admiration and respect to them for that.
Yeah. I mean, I do think,
Definitely.
all the things that you're talking about in terms of make her real, like without her voice, I think I would have had those questions of like, is this the real Skylar? Because especially in death, when people look back on people, they remember specific things based on their experiences. And like you have a great group of people who are doing the interviews and talking about the situation as it happened, but they're still doing it with hindsight. Her parents, the police, her friends, like I still sometimes will hear something one of them says and question it. But to have her voice in it, I think kind of knocks a lot of those questions out. The one question I was still left with, and I don't know if this is just because I'm very cynical and I don't really trust the police, is why it took so long for them to even consider one of her friends could have done this. Like they were looking at the male teens, for specific male teens, not just like everybody, but it felt like it was that time. Maybe it was the time period. It felt like it was that situation of like we still look we still look at young girls like they can't do anything. Like they are victims, but they're not anything else. And I don't know if that's how you felt after talking to anybody, but to me it was like if you look at the spouse when the other spouse is murdered, you have to look at who's closest to the victim. And who was closest to her were these two female friends. And that to this day will always baffle me as how it's a blind spot. Or it seemed like it was a blind spot here.
No, you know what? I think there's kind of like it's the one out of all of them, the one who had their suspicions the most was Jess Colbank, was the female police
Hmm.
officer, and they were blindsided by these girls. They kind of like they believed that they were, they started to believe that they were involved. They felt pity for them. I think it's a very cliche sort of thing. I think like that nobody believed that two young girls could possibly do, first of all, they didn't believe they could possibly be involved. And then obviously, like, it became apparent that they were in some way and they were holding something back. But right up until the kind of confession, they they just believed that they must be hiding something for somebody else. It must be some sort of boys in charge. It must be this. And it's, I think Jess Colbank, I don't know if she says it in the series or not, but I remember her saying, um, only maybe if you've been a teenage girl do you know how kind of like how
I
vicious teenage
guess.
girls
Yeah.
can actually be. Um, and making this series, it was only the kind of the teenage girls, people women who had kind of
Mm.
the other two people who were incredibly frustrated, I think, by things were Marsha and Perry, the prosecutors. two female prosecutors, and I know that, they were just kind of like frustrated by things as well. And unless there had been a confession, I wonder, it's hard to say in hindsight, isn't it? It's
Right.
hard to say. There's a lot of things that were frustrating that I will, things that nowadays would take seconds, phone records and all these
Sure.
sorts of things took, like, they were being sent on kind of fax machines and on CD-ROMs and ridiculous things like that. So there's, and you don't think of that happening back in 2012, but it was still a bit
Yeah.
antiquated. There was that as well, but um, yeah, I think I'd have been tearing my hair out if I'd have been there.
Yeah, it was also what I found interesting was that like it felt to me like they couldn't see outside of their bubble, but then the second Rachel confessed, her words felt enough for them to take it. Like it felt like to me it was like this is just another small town bumbling, we don't know what we're doing. Police department, they'll take her confession, but then they needed proof from Sheila, which I was like, well, now you're also treating these two people very differently. I don't know. I have a thing with a lot of
Yeah,
police.
it's fr- it
So,
frust it frustrates, and they have good explanations for it,
of
that
course,
make
I
sense on
mean,
paper. But yeah, it frustrates the hell out of me, and it frustrates, and it was,
and I'm sure the
and it,
parents, more than anybody, like especially the way
I,
the girls were pretending they were helping and pretending they were like there for them, like that, to then realize like nobody was even considering them, and look what they did to us. They victimized us on top of taking our daughter away.
I think that's the thing. There's almost like there's two crimes. There's kind of like the fact that what they did, and then that's not the end of the story. That's just kind of like, and it's then how they strung everybody along and lied for such a long time, and then we're able to kind of like seemingly enjoy. I mean, the things, and I don't want to give spoilers away, but the
Sure.
things that they were able to do after the police knew that they were guilty, and
Hmm.
the lives they were able to lead for quite a considerable amount of time is
Right.
is like I found really difficult and really shocking and difficult
Yeah.
to deal with. And I can't imagine what it must have been like for her parents and other people who,
Yeah.
um, and also in hindsight, I won't give things away, but the things that they were doing
Well,
with other
that's
friends were just, yeah,
And that's
shocking.
the thing, they're not criminal masterminds, they're teenage girls. So like that you should be able to notice some of it. And the fact that I just can't get past that. And that's not, I mean, that's just, I think your documentary just exposed kind of how unaware or how just we're willing to turn a blind eye to certain things, even if we see behaviors that feel a little weird. Like I'm not even talking about the police in this moment, like the friends. And you got a lot of friends to come and talk about this in hindsight. And I am also curious about the process of that, of like kind of picking whose voices were right for
Mm.
this and how you convince them to do it, given that so much time has passed.
It was really important for us that we had her friends tell the story. I mean, as I said, this was kind of like an inside out retelling of this story. It was, we were adamant that it wasn't going to be just a police procedural kind of story. It was every sort of creative decision we made, we tried to sort of center it from either Skylar's perspective or from her friend's perspective.
Hmm.
And that's hard because they didn't really know what was going on with the
Yeah.
investigation either, but it was trying to center, but as much as we could. Obviously it gets harder towards the end, but that was where we tried to center it all, which kind of kept, but also I think in doing that allowed you to not excuse their behavior, but at least understand the teenager, the kind of the teenage condition, and put you back in that world as much as possible and see what it was like from that kind of perspective. Um, and I think actually, people always say about, how do you persuade people to take part in things? And I think everything is just about trust and being very open and honest about what it is that you're doing. And when people understand that, and you can say, look, this is what we want to do. This is, we told them very early on that we were putting Skylar front and center of this, and how we were going to do that, and how we were going to use social media in this way, and how we were going to use her voice in it. And I think that kind of was maybe one of the things that made people want to take part in this. Um, Even the law enforcement,
Mm.
talked a lot about how they really appreciated that as well, because it's the side of the story that they hadn't had. Some people were talking about it for the first time. some people have talked about it in the past before, but some people were talking about it from the first time. And there's something quite poignant about the fact that Skylar would have turned 30 just a few weeks
Mm,
ago. So that's kind of like, it feels to me like that's kind of quite a milestone. That's sort of an age when, there's like a lot of her friends who we spoke to have got kids of their own. They're not of the social media age yet, but they've got kids of their own, or they're having babies, and
yeah,
reflecting on that kind of period of time. It's that sort of milestone kind of age where it also feels like it's the kind of time when, like now, when it's kind of obviously really prevalent, and we've heard sort of in Australia that they're kind of banning social media for under 16s,
right.
and I know there's kind of talks about it in the UK at the moment, and in Spain, but there's but it's also, enough time has passed that we can kind of see that era for what it was. We're not, we're kind of, but we're distanced
Yeah.
enough from it, but we're also close enough to it that we remember what it was like. It's kind of still in the kind of memory of not too
Mhm.
distant, away. So that's why it also felt like a kind of a poignant time, a kind of the right time to tell this story, I think, as well.
And we're also very close to parole, possibility of parole, because Rachel is eligible again in 2028, and then Sheila's eligible for the first time in 2028. Does that play into any of this in terms of how you talked to the people who were once in their lives? Did you talk to them at all about their feelings about that?
I got the impression that nobody sort of believed uh, that they would be granted parole. There was a very much a feeling that this has just kind of affected this community so much. Rachel's had opportunities before, and it's
Yeah,
been rejected. So, um, and she didn't do anything to help herself in those instances. So, um, uh, what's what has allowed her, though, because Rachel has had these opportunities, she's had a voice. I mean, she had a
hmm,
voice in the first instance, whereas Sheila hasn't. Um, and and in one of those parole hearings, she talked about this theory that, maybe one of the motivations was that, they had this relationship that was being threatened
right.
of being exposed, which I'm a little bit skeptical of, because
Okay,
that story kind of came out. Um, I'm not saying it's not true. I think, it's definitely, but a lot of her friends are not convinced that that's true. You're talking about an environment where everything is shared and everybody knew everything, and so it just
hmm,
fit. And also, uh, Rachel didn't mention this as a motive when she had plenty of opportunity to, just after it had when when she confessed. It only came about several years later, after it had been kind of in a book and various. So
gotcha.
I'm a little bit skeptical. I wouldn't have said that was definitively a motive
Sure.
myself.
No, and I'm
Um,
glad that you brought up that it had come out a few years after the actual case, but before your documentary, because if people don't know the case and don't know all of these details, then bringing it up in the documentary, then one of the questions I would have asked would have been like, well, do you feel like you're outing her in any way? But because you've already addressed no, I want to put that to bed, because that's always like a point of contention as well. Is like, should we tell somebody else's story if they're not telling,
mm,
But like it was already out there. I think she married a woman in
yes, but yeah,
prison. Like we're no one's here to, I mean, no one's here to ruin her life. She ruined her own life, by killing someone. So.
yeah, yeah.
I do also, one of the things I found very interesting about the project itself was also the timeline, because you do spend a lot of time kind of going back and forth between
Mm.
before or after the murder, just like in the telling of the narrative of events that lead up to it. And I'm curious how much of that comes from the nonlinear of it, how much of that comes from like your filmmaking background and the way you wanted to tell the story versus the way that you had to lay out certain facts to make it more concise and more like digestible, given just how much stuff was going on with, the teenagers at the time.
I think it's something that we really wanted to do, because we really wanted there's two narratives, if you like. There's the narrative of, the crime and how that happens, and then there's the narrative of, a friendship and the deterioration of the friendship. And it was really important. If we told it purely chronologically, and sort of episode one is just purely the friendship and that's it, and and so forth, then it would have been you wouldn't have had the space or the time to kind of like really get into that and get into those feelings and chart that kind of like that friendship. And that, I mean, they're like love affairs. Like when you're a teenager, like those kind of friendships are kind of just so intense and they mean so much. And we all felt it was really, really important that the audience could see the heartbreak, the
Mm,
heartache that Skylar was kind of experienced, that her friends were experienced, the kind of like the extremes, the mean girlness, and where that comes from, And so because it's so kind of important. So that was one of the reasons to kind of like to keep kind of like going back and forth, to drop clues as well, obviously to kind of like these, because it was also the way in which it was kind of being discovered both by the police, but also, her friends kind of like re-looking back online and reflecting on things and going to
hmm
go, oh yes, well this happened and that happened and so forth, and that's kind of charting kind of like the investigation in that way as well, kind of starting to uncover the kind of like their relationship and how it had kind of like reached this kind of fever pitch and then kind of like um got to breaking point
right.
by the end.
So I do want to bring this back to you for a second because you talked about having a daughter close in age. And I'm curious when you walk away from a project like this, how you might think differently about the people in your own daughter's life. Like, does this make you paranoid? Does this make you tr want to put different rules in place for how she uses social media, how she checks in with you about when she's with her friends? Like, I don't mean to put you on the spot like as a mom, but at
No,
the same time, like I
yeah.
think about it a lot of like what would have happened if I had social media when I was growing up. And this is obviously worst case scenario, and I'm not trying to say that this is a threat to you or your family, but at the same time, like I do feel like sometimes we have to step back and say like we have all of these tools now where they could keep your kids safe or they could open them up in other ways, and how do we use them for the good areas without kind of overstepping into tracking and like true paranoia.
No, and when I started this, she was 12
Okay.
and she's now just turned 14. And she doesn't, I mean, she's got WhatsApp, but she doesn't have social media
Okay.
outside of that. And it's interesting. She's got friends who don't even have phones, and then she's got friends who seem to have access to everything.
Right.
And, and you kind of navigate. And I also am not naive enough to think that just because she doesn't have it doesn't mean that she doesn't see things, or that, other people's, it has made me not be fearful of being just really open about it and talking about it. So I think, that's been brilliant. That's been good lessons, definitely. And we do talk about it, a lot. And if ever, and, things come up, and she doesn't actually beg me for social media. I don't know whether she's kind of, so
Well,
that's kind of quite
that's good.
fortunate. She's kind of addicted to Spotify. She's a bit like me when I was a teenager. She's obsessed by music. So that's kind of one thing. But I think actually it was a social media thing, but actually as much as it was the social media side, it made me really, address that. I think it's helped me as a mum in the sense of dealing with teenagers and remembering what it's like. It's so easy to
Mm.
forget, and there would be incidences with friends that, there were things that were just, I'd be like, why is she so upset? This is such a minor thing. But, I think as much as the social media side, it's been really good to remind myself of what it was like to be that age and where
Yeah.
everything is kind of extreme, and also to be kind of to take those things seriously, and
Yeah.
not just dismiss it because it's just, oh well, that's just really minor, why are you getting upset about that? And I'm not saying I would have done, but
No, but
it's good to check in with yourself, and be okay, this looks really minor, but actually in her head that's huge, in her friend's head that's enormous, like kind of let's give it this gravitas and listen to her and give her space, to kind of deal with this stuff. So I think hopefully it's helped me.
Yeah.
become a better mom, that, in that way.
Well, that's also what I was thinking of, like also beyond the social media, like just knowing who's in her life and who she's hanging out with. And I don't mean like knowing, oh, I'm going to my friend Jane's house today, but like actually knowing who Jane is and like spending
Yeah.
time. I don't know. My parents never spent time with my friends once we got to a certain age, and I wouldn't have wanted that. But at the same time, it's like, would that have even mattered? You know, they're wearing one face in front of a parent and one face in front of their friends, and but at least like you feel good about, oh, I'm
Mm.
doing what I can, you know what I mean? Like, and exactly
And
what you just said, like I'm taking them seriously, because I think that's the biggest problem, is that like we think their issues are petty, and they kind of are in the long run until they turn into something like this, you know, like a petty thing can explode because they're hormonal and they're emotional, and they just like it's the most important thing to them. And then we didn't take it seriously, and look what happened, you know. And I don't want to go on a soapbox about all the school shootings here in America, but I would
oh,
put those in that category of, you know,
yeah.
if anybody was paying attention to those kids and listening to those kids and getting them the help that they needed, they or and also taking away the access to guns, of course, but getting them the mental help that they needed, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in.
And also, I think it's also easy to forget that actually COVID had a bit of a thing where like uh pre-COVID, there was a period of time, obviously with COVID, like pre-COVID, at least when your kids were in primary school, whatever elementary school, you
Hmm.
would the mums would meet, everybody would be at the school gates, and you'd be
Oh,
well, at least for us, like we'd be walking to school at the school gates, and
sure.
then COVID happened, and everyone has to drop off and a remote, and suddenly there's a disconnect,
Mm,
and so all those relationships, like my relationships with other mums, they were only for mums that I knew pre-COVID.
right.
Like it's really hard to make any friends because then she started secondary school, high school, or whatever it is, and then that kind of is a different kettle of fish anyway. But that COVID, I think, had a real
Mm.
effect on that, on families knowing, at least for like certain
Sure,
generations when they,
yeah.
when they were there, and then suddenly there's this kind, and I'm imagining that it's kind of like we've got that back again, and it's okay. But there's definitely a generation where you didn't know
Hmm.
you didn't mingle with all the parents, and I know parents whose kind of kids started the school in the middle of COVID and struggled because they're like, wait, we don't know anyone.
Yeah,
So that's right, that's on another tangent, but I think that had quite a significant thing. Like you said, it's about knowing who their friends are,
yeah,
and and who they're talking to and who they're hanging out with.
yeah. I also think it is regional, because I will say that we didn't do that where I grew up.
Oh,
A lot of kids would just get on a bus. And so like then
oh
they would
yeah,
just, you know, be dropped off. And so, you know, it was, I guess at school functions is how
yeah.
parents
But
met.
all of
Like,
that stopped, obviously. I don't know.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
maybe it's
But even
different. You're
that, like
right.
no one's really getting to know each other. You know, you're maybe saying
Mm.
hello, or like if you're doing a play date, maybe when they're really little, they're staying there. I know I see that on TV a lot, but that didn't happen with my friends, so I
Uh,
don't know how realistic that is. But you know, it's a good point. It's like it's a lot harder to really know because of the space and the distance, but it's also, I think, a lot harder to really know because, you know, there's a whole other can of worms, is like, well, they're not necessarily staying in that person's house. Like we see with Skylar and her friends going to those parties, and that, you know, how the police were looking at people involved in those parties for a long time. And is that's fair, you know, it's fair to look at them and consider them, because who knew what was really going on. But at the same time, that's not really avoidable. I think that that just
no,
comes with, you know, growing up. And so you just have to, at a certain point, I don't advocate tracking anyone's phone, but you have to just trust that like everything's gonna be okay, which sounds crazy to me. Like I'm not a parent, but like that sounds like I could never do that. I will just
yeah,
speak for
it's the
myself.
hardest thing. It's the hardest thing.
Yeah, yeah. I'll
It's the
just trust
hardest
it's gonna
thing.
be fine. Just trust everyone is nice. I don't know. I don't know. I'm not trying to
Yeah,
freak you out.
no.
I'm sure
No,
everything
no,
is
no, no,
much
no,
better
no,
where
no.
you live.
Well, yeah, like you said, I don't want to get into all of that, but yeah, it does. Yeah, I'm glad that she's at school at high school in the UK.
Yes. Yes.
Mm.
Okay,
Mm.
so did this project change anything in terms of the stories that you want to tell going forward? Did this affect kind of the next thing you want to do, whether it is, I need to get out of that teen headset, or mindset, or like I want to tell more longer form series stories? Like, did it affect anything on any part of your creativity?
I don't think it kind of made me think I didn't want to do anything at all. I think every project I have to really find the niche that makes me
Yeah.
like kind of go, this is how we can do this. Maybe not like revolutionize the medium or anything, but this is how we can do things like in a fresh perspective or different or whatever, in that kind of a way, and have a really strong vision for it. So um I don't I don't think it did in that. I think it definitely satisfied maybe like a childhood itch to make a teen movie. I think maybe
Like a
maybe
narrative? Or are you saying like it
no, I
satisfied
just
you
mean in the
don't need
sense
to
that
do?
maybe I don't need to because I kind of like had a little bit of so maybe it did
Yeah.
that. But and it was and it that always kind of inspires things, you kind of go, oh well, we experimented a little bit with this, it was great to take it to that level. So like on the Contestant we did a lot of sort of graphics. Ironically, we were trying very hard to make the graphics look as bad as possible because we were trying to make them look like 90s graphics. So it's like
I
it's
wouldn't have said
hilariously
bad. I would have just said it's a specific style of the time.
it
Like,
it's
that's not a bad
yeah.
thing.
It wasn't, but I did spend a long time with the VFX artist Jason Martin on that one, kind of going, oh, could you just like degrade it a little bit more? Could you make it look a little bit more lo-fi? Could you a little bit more VHS? And that, um, so and it's kind of a bit too cool. Can we have it a bit
Hmm.
less? So that was on that one, and this one. I mean, I kind of was already aware of the headache of VFX and graphics anyway, so I'm not sure why we took it on like that. But we'd we did this thing where the teenage world of social media was kind of like an extension of their lives. It wasn't, just this thing that kind of, was a separate world that they kind of came to after school. It was something, it was just an extension of their language. And we really wanted to get that sense across that it was kind of integrated in the environment, but it was also completely invisible to the adult world. So we have these kind of like tweets come up on football fields
Hmm.
and in corridors and we caused a real headache for everybody by me by having this kind of complicated kind of language, but it felt really important to kind of
Hmm.
like push ourselves in that way, and it was lovely kind of pushing some of the stuff that I'd done in the Contestant even further in that way. So I kind of feel like I'm kind of done with VFX and graphics for a
Okay.
bit, but you know what? I kind of like it all depends on the next project, and if I feel that there's like a real need for it,
Right.
then I might go down that road. But it's every story is kind of I said it sounds like a cliche, but it's true. Every single story is unique, and you use the different experiences that have come to you
Yeah.
from kind of like your childhood or your previous things that you've worked on, or whatever it is, or the things that are going on in your world right now.
Hmm.
You draw from all of those things, and they all kind of seem to kind of come out for it. So it's hard to say what the next thing,
Sure.
what direction it might take.
You did say, drawing from things now, but I want to make this go backwards and say,
Mm.
talked about all of, a lot of different music video directors that inspired you when you were younger. Do you ever feel like you want to do some sort of bio documentary? Like pick one of them and kind of tell their story through whatever,
Oh,
behind the scenes footage,
yeah.
interviews, like however you would put it together as a final project. But is that, or are these people that you just feel like, they should tell their own story? I want to stay a fan.
I don't know. It is hard, isn't it? Like they say so don't meet your heroes, don't they? Kind of like because that's one thing. I think it would be interesting to go into that world. You know what would be more interesting though, is to go into the world of the musicians talking about the music video directors, I think. When you hear I remember seeing an interview or reading an interview of Massive Attack talking about working with Michel Gondry, and then all kind of saying, well, we just couldn't understand what he was on about. And nobody understood, his vision until he got out a whole Lego model and brought it down the
Hmm.
pub. And then they kind of like, and then he goes, and then I'm not going to do my French accent, but he was kind of describing, they went, oh, I see, and you get this real sense. So in a weird way, I think, yeah, that would be kind of quite, I quite like that alternative kind of
Mhm.
get them to talk about the music video directors in that way would be kind of quite an interesting
Yeah.
a way of doing that. I don't know if anybody else is as geekily into music videos from the 90s, 90s, that specific
Well,
niche period as me. I don't
you're
know.
not picking obscure ones. You're picking, ones that are very visually specific and with directors who are big names.
Mm,
So but I do think you just proved
yeah.
the point of why you do what you do and why you're one of BAFTA's breakthrough Brits because you came up with a documentary idea on the spot that was better than what I asked. So yes, I think you should do it. And then come back and talk about it because this was so fun. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. This has been brilliant fun.
All right, before you all scatter, I like to leave you with where to find the things that we discussed on today's episode of the podcast. And we started talking about early 1990s or just 1990s in general music videos. And since there's a plethora of music videos, I want to send you to YouTube. And I know I don't usually like to send you to YouTube because they're not always up there legally and therefore they might not be there forever. So just take that as a warning when you search for these videos. Then, of course, Claire's latest project, the docuseries Friends Like These, The Murder of Skylar Neese, that premieres on Hulu and Disney Plus March 6th, and it is a three-part docuseries, so you want to check out all three parts. This has been made possible by Pop Culture, the podcast. Once again, I have to thank you all for listening and or watching, liking, commenting, subscribing, following on social media, whatever it is that you're doing to support me and this podcast. I really, really appreciate it. Don't go anywhere because we have lots more episodes coming up this season.